Have you ever wondered what happens in the wild when no one is watching? When a human vanishes into the silence of nature, far beyond roads and rescue signals, do the rules of survival shift? Or does something ancient, instinctive, and almost impossible, take over? This is not a story you've heard before. It isn't a legend whispered by firelight or some romantic tale passed down through generations. This is something that really happened. Something so rare and unnerving that even seasoned survivalists are still trying to wrap their heads around it. And at the center of it all is a bear. Not the kind you run from, not the kind you fear, but one that changed everything. It all started deep within the icy lungs of Denali National Park, a place both breathtaking and brutal. Located in the heart of Alaska, Denali is not just wilderness. It's a kingdom ruled by snow, wind, and silence. In late February, with the sun barely lifting above the horizon, temperatures can plummet to a soul-crushing 30 degrees Celsius. Whiteouts strike with no warning. GPS fails. Tracks vanish in minutes. And that's where this begins. Matthew Cole, a 33-year-old outdoor enthusiast from Anchorage, had skied these backcountry routes before. He was no amateur. Friends described him as meticulous, someone who studied maps like scripture and checked weather patterns like a pilot. But even the most prepared are no match for nature when it decides to turn. On that morning, Matthew set out alone, cutting across a ridge lined with ancient pines and powdered cliffs. He was chasing solitude like many who visit Denali. The kind of solitude where you feel the pulse of the earth beneath your feet and the weight of the sky above your head. But somewhere along that trail, something went wrong. He missed a checkpoint, then another. His GPS last pinged near Polychrome Pass, but after that, nothing. When Matthew didn't return that night, concern turned to panic. By the next morning, Denali Search and Rescue launched a full-scale operation. Trained teams, helicopters, drones, even avalanche dogs. They scoured ridgelines, scanned frozen lakes, dug through snowbanks. But Denali wasn't giving anything up. For 48 hours, the park swallowed Matthew Cole whole. No signals, no footprints. Just wind, ice, and that terrifying, echoing stillness. The kind of silence that grows louder the longer you listen. People began to brace themselves for the worst. In Denali, the clock runs faster. Every hour is a battle against hypothermia, frostbite, exhaustion. The storm that rolled in on the second night didn't help either. Visibility dropped to less than a few feet. The helicopters had to turn back. And in that moment, the question wasn't, will they find him? But will there be anything left to find? And yet, something unexplainable was happening out there. Something no one could see. Not the search crews, not the family glued to their phones in Anchorage, not the rangers mapping every inch of the frozen terrain. Because Matthew wasn't entirely alone. Somewhere beneath the swirling snow, in the deep breath of the forest, another heartbeat had entered the scene. Presence large, warm, and very much alive. It wasn't searching, it wasn't hunting, it was simply waiting. And this is where the story begins to change. Because what happened next defied everything we thought we knew about wild animals. About survival. About what happens when a man is completely at the mercy of the elements, and something wild chooses to intervene. The storm didn't knock. It crashed through Denali like a runaway freight train. By the evening of the second day, snow was falling so hard it blurred the edges of everything. The forest disappeared. The sky, the ground, even the towering mountains that usually ruled the horizon. All of it faded into a white, shapeless void. Wind screamed through the trees with a violence that felt personal, snapping branches like brittle bones and carrying with it the unmistakable scent of deep wilderness, pine, ice, and something primal. This was no ordinary snowstorm. It was the kind of blizzard that breaks people, not just physically but mentally. Search crews were grounded, radios crackled with static. Teams that had fanned out earlier were called back. No one could see more than a few feet ahead. Drones iced over mid-flight and spiraled uselessly into the snow. There would be no rescue tonight. Inside their home in Anchorage, Matthew Cole's parents sat in silence, the TV glowing in the corner, showing weather maps that looked more like warnings from another planet. His sister clutched her phone, scrolling through old photos. Matthew laughing on a camping trip. Matthew standing beside his skis, cheeks flushed with wind and joy. She kept waiting for a message that never came, and the fear began to harden into something colder, something final. But miles away, beneath that monstrous sky, something extraordinary was unfolding. Matthew, barely conscious, had taken refuge in a shallow dip between two ice-covered boulders. Snow had piled high around him, turning the space into a crude, frozen cocoon. His limbs were stiff. His breath came out in slow, ragged gasps. His fingers no longer felt real. Darkness pressed in, not the soft kind that leads to sleep, but the thick, suffocating kind that comes before the end. And then, he felt movement. Not wind, not snow, something heavy, close, alive. At first, he thought his mind was slipping. Hallucinations aren't rare in extreme cold. Your brain, starved of heat and oxygen, begins to tell stories. But this wasn't a dream. This was weight, pressure, breath. He opened his eyes just enough to see a massive shape beside him, outlined in the shadows. Fur matted with snow, steam rising from its back, breath fogging the air in heavy puffs. A bear. Not a vision. Not a monster. A real living brown bear, larger than anything Matthew had ever seen in the wild. And it wasn't attacking, it wasn't growling. It was lying down beside him, curling into him, pressing its dense, warm body against his frozen frame. The shock almost stole the rest of his strength. His instincts told him to scream, to run, to fight. But there was no strength left. And somehow, in the deepest part of his being, Matthew understood. The bear wasn't there to hurt him. It was sheltering him, protecting him from the wind, from the cold, from death. It was absurd. It was miraculous. And it was happening. For hours, he doesn't know how many, Matthew drifted in and out of consciousness, wrapped in fur and warmth, while the storm howled overhead. The bear's breathing became a rhythm in the night, slow and deep, almost meditative. Its presence turned the frozen tomb into a sanctuary, the kind of rescue no one could have planned, no one would have believed, until now. If you love real survival stories like this one, and want to uncover what really happened in the mountains that night, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't believe what's coming next. Outside, the forest was chaos. Trees bent under the weight of snow. Wolves howled from distant ridgelines. But here, in this impossible bubble of warmth and life, something ancient was unfolding. A connection between man and beast that defied instinct, logic, and every rule of nature. Some say animals operate purely on survival, that they don't feel, that they don't choose. But that night, something inside that bear, something no scientist could measure, made it stay. And Matthew, still clinging to life, didn't move. He couldn't. The warmth of the bear was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. He listened to the wind screaming around them, the snow smothering the sky, and the slow, deep heartbeat beside him. One that was not his own, but that somehow, for reasons we may never understand, had chosen to keep him alive. Matthew didn't know how much time had passed since the storm hit. Time in the wilderness has a strange way of stretching. Seconds become minutes, minutes become eternities. The only thing he could feel now was the cold tightening around him like a fist. It was in his bones, in his breath, in the corners of his mind. He had stopped shivering hours ago, which wasn't a good sign. That's when the cold starts to win. His body, stripped of warmth and energy, moved automatically, instinctively. He had managed to crawl under a collapsed pine tree, its snow-covered branches forming a crude shelter. It wasn't much, but it was something. Just enough to keep the worst of the wind at bay. Lying on his side, knees pulled tightly to his chest, Matthew began to whisper things, memories, apologies, names. He thought about his mom, the sound of her voice when he was little. He pictured a summer trail he used to hike in Chugach. He imagined heat, but it didn't come. Only more silence, only more cold. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrifying acceptance began to settle. This was it. This was how it would end. Alone, frozen, unfound. But that's not what happened. Because in that moment, when all hope was slipping through his fingertips like melting snow, something stirred. He didn't hear it at first. He felt it. A shift in the air. A presence. The weight of something real, something moving through the storm with purpose. There was a faint crunch, the sound of snow compacting under something heavy. And then, heat. Not imagined, not dreamed. Actual physical heat brushing against his frozen back. Matthew's first thought was absurd. He thought it might be a hallucination shaped by memory. His dog from childhood, a large blanket, a fire. But none of those made sense. Not here. Not in the unforgiving belly of Denali, where nothing soft survives. He opened one eye, barely able to focus. It was massive, covered in dark, snow-dusted fur. Steam rose from its body like mist. The shape of it took a moment to register, and when it did, a jolt of adrenaline lit up what little strength he had left. It was a bear, a real bear, wild, powerful, close enough that he could see its breath clouding the air between them. Every instinct inside him screamed, "Danger! Bears don't cuddle. They don't save." But this one didn't move to attack. It didn't charge or roar or show its teeth. Instead, it settled beside him, carefully, almost intentionally. It pressed its massive body against Matthew's back, the heat radiating like a small furnace. Matthew didn't move. He couldn't. But more than that, he wouldn't. Somehow he understood. The bear wasn't there to end his life. It was there to preserve it. Wrapped in fur and disbelief, Matthew stayed perfectly still, his breath shallow, his eyes wide. The bear didn't seem threatened or agitated. If anything, it looked calm, as though it had made a decision and was now following through. For hours, maybe longer, man and beast remained locked in that impossible position. The storm raged outside, but here, under that tree, was something otherworldly. A moment suspended between instinct and miracle. The warmth began to do strange things to Matthew's mind. He started drifting between wakefulness and something deeper. He dreamed of firelight. He dreamed of silence breaking. He dreamed of being a child again, wrapped in a heavy quilt, safe from the world. And every time he stirred, the bear adjusted too. Closer, firmer, guarding, sharing its body heat in the only way it could. It was survival in hours past, though how many Matthew couldn't tell. Time had lost all shape, dissolved into a dreamlike fog where everything was still, muffled, and impossibly slow. His body was still freezing, his lips cracked, his limbs numb. But something had shifted. He wasn't fading anymore. He was hovering, caught in some liminal space between death and survival. The warmth was real. That was the only thing he could hold on to. The warmth that wasn't his. That surrounded him, pulsed against his back, rose invisible clouds that curled upward into the frozen air. It was primal, fierce, alive. And then came the moment he would never forget. Matthew, fighting through the haze of his exhaustion and near hypothermic delirium, turned his head slightly, just enough to bring the shape beside him into clearer focus. His eyelashes, crusted with frost, blinked slowly. At first, all he saw was dark fur, then the curve of a massive shoulder, the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of a broad chest. Finally, he found its face, and that's when the fear kicked in, sharper than the cold, more sobering than any blizzard. A bear. A full-grown brown bear, its eyes half closed, its massive body curled protectively around him like a living shield. Its breath, thick and heavy, came in visible plumes, like smoke from an ancient engine. It was right there, just inches from his face, the warm puffs of air fogging up the space between them. But the bear wasn't growling. It wasn't showing teeth. It wasn't doing any of the things that would have made Matthew panic and bolt if he'd had the strength. It was still, present, calm. Didn't make sense. Nothing in the manuals, nothing in survival training, nothing in the documentaries or books or ranger briefings ever said anything about this. A bear, especially in winter, was supposed to avoid humans, or worse, But this one didn't seem interested in hurting him. It seemed impossibly like it had chosen to stay. Was it curiosity? Instinct? Something deeper? Matthew didn't know. All he knew was that he was alive, and this creature, this wild, unpredictable force of nature, was the only reason why. He lay there, blinking slowly, locked in a silent understanding with the beast beside him. His breath grew slower, his mind clearer. Every few minutes the bear would adjust slightly, shifting its weight to block the wind, pressing closer as the cold intensified. It felt like being held by the wild itself. There was a point, brief, surreal, where Matthew swore he saw something in the bear's eyes. Not hunger, not fear, but something like awareness, connection, as if the animal understood what was happening and had made a choice to act against every expectation of its kind. It was so far outside the realm of logic that it almost hurt to think about. And yet, here it was, a moment of impossible grace in the deadliest place on earth. Have you ever heard of an animal doing something like this? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this moment left even the rescue team speechless. In the hours that followed, the storm began to shift. The wind, while still relentless, slowed just enough for moonlight to break through the clouds, scattering a silver glow across the snowdrifts. Matthew, still too weak to move, watched the bear's silhouette in the pale light, stunned by how calm it remained. The silence was no longer empty, pulsed with something sacred, and as the blizzard gave way to that haunting stillness, Matthew realized he wasn't just being saved, he was being kept, protected, not just by the warmth, but by the sheer presence of something bigger than instinct, bigger than either of them. He didn't speak, he couldn't, but in his heart, a whisper formed. Why? Why would a bear do this? No one would believe it. He barely believed it himself. But he knew, deep in the marrow of his freezing bones, that this wasn't random. This wasn't chance. This was something ancient, something wild, something real. And it wasn't over yet. At some point during that frozen night, the fear dissolved. Not because the danger had passed, but because something far more powerful had taken its place. Surrender. Not the kind born from giving up, but the kind that grows when there's nothing left to control. When your life is no longer in your own hands, and all you can do is trust in the moment, however wild and unexpected it may be. That's where Matthew found himself, cradled between snow and muscle, the ancient rhythm of a creature's breathing guiding him through a night that should have killed him. He couldn't feel his legs. His hands were stiff and blue, but his core, impossibly, remained warm. Not comfortable. This wasn't comfort. It was survival. Raw, unfiltered, fragile. Outside, the storm howled with less rage now, as if it had grown tired. The wind still pushed snow into high drifts and rattled the trees like bones, but the worst of it had passed. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, low and haunting, reminding the forest that life, against all odds, continued. Matthew's awareness came and went like waves. He would drift, not quite dreaming, then jolt awake as the bear shifted behind him. Each time, the massive body beside him was there, solid, breathing, anchoring him to this world. He never saw the animal's eyes again that night. He didn't need to. He felt it. Every breath, every shift of weight, every unspoken agreement that they would face this night together. For 6 hours, they stayed that way, man and beast, back to back, not enemies, not predator and prey, just two creatures, equally vulnerable in their own ways, enduring the storm as one. At some point, Matthew stopped questioning why. There were no more what-ifs, no space for fear or logic. There was only instinct, his and the bear's, and whatever that invisible thread was that kept them connected in the dark. He doesn't remember falling asleep. It just happened, like the body finally giving in, like a final switch turning off after being forced to run on nothing but adrenaline and will. The darkness took him without resistance, but when he opened his eyes again, the world had changed. The air had stilled, the wind was gone, replaced by a gentle quiet that felt almost reverent, the kind of silence that settles after something sacred has occurred. Light, real golden light, was breaking through the skeletal fingers of the pine trees above. Morning had come, and with it, the impossible truth that he had survived. Matthew's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. He was alive. His heart was still beating. His body, aching, stiff but undeniably whole, was still here, still his. He blinked against the soft sunlight, then turned his head slowly to the side where the bear had been. But it was gone. No trace, no paw prints, no trail of broken branches, only a subtle depression in the snow where the two of them had laid. As if nature itself had closed the chapter, erased the witness, sealed the miracle with quiet dignity. At first he thought maybe he had dreamed it, that the cold and trauma had fractured his mind. But then he noticed something. His body heat hadn't just come back on its own. That kind of warmth doesn't grow in a vacuum. And in the hollow of the snow where the bear had laid, the ice was still melted. There had been another body, a living one, massive, protective, real. He sat up slowly, every muscle screaming in protest. The effort made him dizzy. His vision swam, and for a second, the world tilted. But he steadied himself with one gloved hand, planting it into the snow as if to ground himself in the truth of what had happened. The truth was this: something had saved him. Something with fur. Something with instincts that ran deeper than violence. Something that stayed, not because it had to, but because, for reasons we may never understand, it chose to. He scanned the woods, half expecting to see a shape moving between the trees. A flash of brown fur, a pair of watchful eyes, but there was nothing. Just the whispering forest and the distant caw of a raven announcing the dawn. The bear had done what it came to do, and then without a sound, it had vanished. Matthew's next challenge would be getting out. His ordeal wasn't over. But what had just taken place, that sacred exchange between two forms of life in the belly of a blizzard, that would never leave him. It was burned into his memory, etched into his bones. Proof that in the wildest corners of this world, something deeper than survival still exists. Something unspoken, something ancient. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the snow, Matthew pulled his arms tighter to his chest and took his first full breath in what felt like days, preparing for whatever came next. It was sometime just after dawn when the first faint mechanical hum broke through the stillness of the forest. The distant chopper blades sliced the cold morning air like a heartbeat from the modern world. For a moment, Matthew didn't believe it was real. After everything, after the storm, the night, the bear, this new sound felt foreign, even jarring. But as it grew louder, he lifted his head with what little energy he had left and recognized it. Rescue. The search and rescue team had nearly called off the search that morning. The storm had rerouted their plans more than once. Visibility had been too poor, the conditions too dangerous. But a single ranger had argued for one more pass, a hunch, nothing more, and the chopper lifted off in a final sweep across the frozen ridges. What they saw from above didn't make sense. From the air, it looked like a trail, faint but unmistakable. A single winding line pressed into the snow, leading from the edge of a glacial shelf into the deeper woods. What stunned them, though, was that the prints weren't alone. Side by side with human footprints were enormous paw prints, bear tracks, and not wandering aimlessly, not circling or chasing, moving in parallel. It was enough to bring the chopper down. Matthew was still curled against the tree when they reached him, covered in frost, pale, barely responsive, but alive. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of boots crunching snow. The rescuers rushed in with blankets, thermal packs, warm fluids. One of them knelt beside him, gently checking his vitals, while another called in the medevac. "Matthew," the medic said softly, "you're okay now. You're safe." He blinked slowly, lips cracked and trembling. For a moment, they thought he wouldn't speak, that perhaps he couldn't. But then in the weakest whisper, he said the words that would leave the entire team frozen in disbelief. "The bear saved me." There was silence, Then someone said, "What?" thinking they'd misheard. But Matthew repeated it a little louder this time, his voice hoarse but certain. "It laid next to me all night. It didn't leave. It kept me warm. I would have died out here. But the bear, it stayed." The rescuers exchanged stunned glances. One of them, a seasoned tracker who had worked Denali for over 15 years, slowly turned to the trail behind them. The prints were still there, massive, distinct, not just near Matthew, but leading directly to him, then looping gently around the tree. The bear had circled him and laid down. For a long moment, no one spoke. They had trained for all kinds of emergencies, avalanches, injuries, hypothermia, animal attacks. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for this. A rescue by an apex predator? A wild bear acting as guardian instead of threat? They airlifted Matthew out with urgent care. His core temperature was dangerously low, and he had mild frostbite on both hands and feet. But considering the conditions, and the hours spent exposed in sub-zero weather, his survival was nothing short of extraordinary. Doctors said the warmth was what saved him. Had he stayed alone without insulation or shelter, he would have gone into cardiac arrest before sunrise. But somehow his body heat had stabilized just enough to hang on. A miracle, they called it. An anomaly. Impossible to explain. But Matthew insisted, again and again, in interviews, in the hospital bed, to his family. To the ranger who returned to the site days later and found no signs of aggression, no blood, no signs of struggle, just that unmistakable pattern in the snow. A man, a bear, together. If this story gave you chills or warmed your heart, smash that like button. Let's show some love for this miracle in the wild. Because even now, long after the storm has passed and Matthew's body has healed, the mystery of that night remains. Why didn't the bear leave? Why did it approach him in the first place? Why didn't it see him as a threat or prey? We may never know the answers, but the truth is written in the tracks, frozen in the snow, burned into Matthew's memory forever. And it's only just beginning to surface, what it means, what it changes. Because in a world that often feels harsh, wild, and indifferent, something happened out there that defied everything we thought we knew. Something that left more than footprints behind. News of Matthew's survival spread fast, not just because he had lived through one of the deadliest storms of the season, but because of how he survived. His story didn't just make headlines, it sparked a firestorm of questions. Headlines called it a miracle in Denali. Commentators used words like unthinkable, beyond explanation, 1 in a billion. But no one could deny one simple fact. Something had happened out there that broke every known rule about how wild animals behave. Within hours of Matthew's interview being released, wildlife experts from across the country began weighing in. Most were skeptical. Some were outright dismissive. Bears are wild predators, one researcher from a large university stated. They are not emotionally motivated. They operate on instinct, not empathy. Whatever happened out there had to be misunderstood or exaggerated by the victim. But that theory fell apart when the search and rescue team released photos, aerial shots of the tracks, perfectly preserved in the snow, human boot prints, and alongside them, bear prints, deep, deliberate, and mirroring Matthew's path for dozens of yards. The images were clear. This bear had followed him, had stopped beside him, had not attacked, had not wandered aimlessly. It had chosen to stay. Dr. Ellen Greaves, a field biologist specializing in predator-prey dynamics in Arctic regions, paused when she was shown the images. She studied them in silence for a full minute before speaking. "This doesn't align with anything I've seen in the literature. It's not just rare, it's alien to everything we understand about ursine behavior." When asked if she believed Matthew's claim, her voice softened. "I'm not ready to say I understand it, but I don't believe he's lying." Others weren't as restrained. One researcher labeled it an emotional fabrication, saying trauma can cause people to rewrite events in their minds. Another suggested the bear was likely seeking warmth itself, and Matthew's presence was incidental. Just another heat source in a frozen forest. But the locals in Denali, they weren't so quick to doubt. In the remote town of Healy, where snow is a way of life and stories travel faster than cell signal, the elders shared a different perspective. Around wood-burning stoves and over mugs of black coffee, whispers began to surface. Not gossip, not rumors, old memories, old beliefs. They spoke of the Nalakuk, a guardian of the storm. According to ancient Athabaskan and Denali lore, there were tales, long dismissed as legend, of a spirit bear that appeared during blizzards, a creature neither fully physical nor entirely spectral. Said to walk the line between worlds, the Nalakuk came not to harm but to guide, to shield, to appear in moments when death was certain, and to change the ending. One elder, a woman named Kunik, simply nodded when she saw the photos. "He was chosen," she said. "Not everyone gets the bear, only those who are seen." That phrase echoed in Matthew's ears days later. Only those who are seen. He wasn't sure what it meant, but something about it felt right. This wasn't just a strange act of nature. It wasn't about instincts or misunderstood behavior. It was something older, wiser, something that science hadn't caught up with yet. And then came more stories, emails, letters, social media posts, other hikers, campers, skiers, people who had spent time in the remote wilderness of Alaska, began to come forward, some anonymous, some hesitant, all with similar whispers, of moments when they too felt a presence, of unexplained encounters, of bears who stood too still, watched too long, turned away instead of charging. Not one of these stories had ever been taken seriously. Until now, and Matthew. He wasn't trying to prove anything, he wasn't looking to convince skeptics. He just told the truth as he remembered it. A bear came to him in the dead of night. Didn't leave, didn't kill, saved him. Was it instinct? Was it chance? Or was it something more? Even now, with the storm far behind him and the scars of that night fading into memory, Matthew Cole finds himself haunted, not by fear or trauma, but by a question that refuses to leave. Why? He replays it over and over in his mind. The snow, the silence, the weight of the bear's body curled around him, the warmth, the stillness, the absence of aggression, the decision to stay. None of it makes sense under the cold logic of wilderness survival. Nature doesn't offer second chances. In Denali, you either beat the cold or you become part of it. That's the rule. And yet, he survived. Not because he built a shelter, not because he had the right gear, not because he found a way out, but because something found him. Something wild, something primal, something that most people would run from. He sometimes wonders if it was all real, if his freezing mind played tricks on him, if the bear was never there, if it was some hallucination born from desperation, a dream made flesh in the darkest hour. But then he remembers the tracks, the depression in the snow, the heat that no hypothermic body could create alone, the look on the rescuers' faces, the words of the old woman who said simply, "He was seen." What was the bear doing out in a blizzard like that? Bears aren't supposed to be awake in February. They're supposed to be deep in their dens, conserving energy, asleep until spring stirs the earth back to life. And yet, that one was awake. Not just moving, but waiting, watching, choosing. Matthew doesn't claim to have the answers. He doesn't try to label what happened anymore. The more he talks about it, the less it fits into any neat box. Every theory feels too small. Coincidence? Maybe. But what are the odds of a bear, not just appearing, but staying with a man it could have easily ignored or ended? Instinct? Possible. But what instinct tells a bear to share its warmth? To lie silently next to a human being? To hold its ground through a storm with no reward? Divine intervention. That's the one that keeps him up at night. He doesn't come from a particularly religious background, but something about that night shifted his worldview. It wasn't just survival. It was presence. A moment where the natural and the supernatural seemed to blur, where something wearing fur became something more, something sacred. He's heard all the opinions, the skeptics, the believers, the ones who say it was fate, the ones who call it luck, the ones who think the bear saw a fellow creature in distress and simply responded, not with instinct, but with compassion. The idea sounds crazy in scientific circles, but then again, most miracles do. And so the question lingers, hanging in the cold like breath in the air. What do you believe? Was it just an anomaly in the wild, a one-in-a-billion situation where biology misfired and man benefited? Or was it something deeper, something older than science, older than myth, something that speaks to a forgotten truth buried deep inside the wilderness itself, a truth that maybe we've stopped listening for, because sometimes the forest answers back. Where are you watching this from? And do you believe that bear saved his life, or was it something else entirely? Maybe you've had your own unexplainable moment, a time when something should have gone wrong, but didn't, when something stepped in, when the odds said you were finished, but you weren't. Maybe it wasn't a bear, maybe it wasn't a blizzard, but maybe, just maybe, you've felt that same pause in the universe, that breath of mystery, that quiet knowing that something beyond logic had intervened. People will believe what they want. That's always been the way. Some will dismiss Matthew's story as fantasy. Others will file it under folklore. But there are those, especially those who've spent time in the deep wild, who will understand immediately. They'll know what it means to be watched by something they can't name, to be seen, to be spared, and to carry that weight forever, without ever fully knowing why. After that day, Matthew Cole was never the same, not in a dramatic overnight way, but in quiet ways that only those closest to him could recognize. He didn't talk much during his first weeks home, not about the storm, not about the rescue, and certainly not about the bear. But something had shifted in his eyes. He looked at the world differently, slower, quieter, with a kind of reverence you don't just wake up with. You earn it out there somewhere between life and whatever almost took it away. He returned to Anchorage eventually, but he didn't go back to his old routine. No more weekend ski trips with friends. No more solo excursions into backcountry trails. He still loved the snow, the trees, the wide skies of Alaska, but now he approached it differently. Not as a playground, not even as a challenge, but as something sacred. He calls it the silence. The sacred silence of Denali, he once said in an interview, speaking softly, carefully, as if the words themselves carried weight. It's not the absence of sound. It's something else. It's what surrounds you when you realize you're not the center of the story. He now gives talks, small gatherings in local community centers, schools, sometimes at ranger lodges or wilderness training events. He never sensationalizes what happened. He doesn't call it a miracle. He doesn't try to convince anyone. He simply tells his story and lets people sit with it. Some cry, some look away, some stare at him like they want to believe but don't know how. But what they all feel, what they all remember long after, is the part where he says the bear stayed. He doesn't elaborate much anymore, not like he used to. In those early days, he'd repeat every detail over and over, trying to understand it himself. But as time passed, words began to fail him. There were things about that night that logic couldn't explain and language couldn't hold. Now, when someone asks about the bear, he just pauses. It came for a reason, he says, and it left when it was done. That's all. Sometimes he hikes out near Denali, not to ski, not to camp, just to walk the edges of the forest. He doesn't go deep. He doesn't want to disturb anything. He just stands among the trees and listens, for wind, for birds, for silence. Every now and then, he swears he hears something move, something large, but it always fades before he can turn. He doesn't go looking. If it was meant to return, it would. Instead, he spends his days differently now. He volunteers with wildlife education programs, teaching kids how to safely exist in nature without conquering it. He speaks at rescue team training sessions, reminding them that sometimes survival isn't about skill or planning. It's about surrender. He leads mindfulness retreats on the edge of national parks, helping people reconnect with the wilderness, not as a danger, but as a teacher. People sometimes ask if he's afraid of the cold, of animals, of going back out there. No, he always answers. Not anymore. I'm not afraid of the wild. I'm afraid of forgetting what it gave me. He wears a small leather cord around his wrist now. Tied into the loop is a single carved wooden bear, worn smooth by time and touch. He never says where it came from. He never takes it off. Those closest to him say he's quieter now, slower to anger, less distracted. He pays attention to things other people miss, the way the wind moves through pine needles, the hush between snowfall and melt, the way certain animals pause before crossing a path, as if waiting for permission, as if they know something we don't. He hasn't spoken publicly about trying to find the bear again. There's no mission, no obsession. He says some things aren't meant to be chased. Some stories aren't meant to have a sequel. You live it, you honor it, and you move forward with it written into your bones. Because whether you believe it was destiny, coincidence, or something divine cloaked in fur and instinct, Matthew believes only one thing with certainty. That night, he wasn't alone. Sometimes, when no one is around and the forest is still, Matthew closes his eyes and listens. Not for footsteps, not for movement, but for that same feeling he had under the pine tree that night. The presence, the quiet pulse of something watching, not to harm but to guard. He doesn't try to name it anymore, doesn't try to explain it. Some things are meant to be carried, not solved. And maybe that's what this whole story is about. Not just a man surviving against all odds, not just a wild animal doing the unthinkable, but the invisible thread between them, the silence that said more than words. The moment when the rules didn't apply and something, call it instinct, call it fate, call it grace, stepped in and changed the ending. What happened out there in Denali wasn't just a survival story. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, even in the loneliest corners of the earth, we are not always alone. And sometimes the wild, so feared, so misunderstood, becomes the very thing that saves us. This wasn't just a story of survival. It was a reminder that we're never truly alone in the wild. If this story touched something deep inside you, subscribe now, and don't miss the next unbelievable rescue coming up right here on your screen. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story moved you in any way, if it made you pause, reflect, or believe in something bigger, then your journey with us is just beginning. We tell real stories, stories of wonder, of wild beauty, of the moments that change people forever. Subscribe and be part of it, because the next miracle might already be on its way, and you won't want to miss it.